All right, good people. Awesome. So I think the stream is going to set up right now. Cool. So I want to use the time right now to really give y'all a good guide for getting your projects up to GitHub, right? And as anybody who starts hearing about web dev or mobile dev or anything professional in the web, software space, we end up having to use GitHub. So just as a reference, just give me a thumbs up if you've heard of GitHub before, right? Like you've somebody told you, hey, you need to know about GitHub, like GitHub this, GitHub that, right? Like I'm sure a good amount of y'all have heard about GitHub and have been encouraged to use it in a different in many different capacities. So right now what I want to do is pretend like you don't know anything about it, what you need to know, how we're going to get it working, and how we get our projects up there um, in a realistic way, because not everybody will tell you some of the things I'm going to tell you today. Awesome. So let's get that cracking. First thing I want to do is share my screen and let's just take a look at really what GitHub is. Whoops, on the wrong screen. All that prep and I was on the wrong screen. Could you believe that? That was crazy. I was like, that was not pro YouTuber of me. That was amateur. Anyway, here we are at GitHub's website, y'all. You know, it took us a minute to get here, but you've probably been here at least one time, right? GitHub is an amazing resource that we use for engineering in all capacities. It is a place that serves both a functional purpose in our work, but it also serves a kind of like professional networking purpose for our work as well. And so I want to kind of just give you the primer to GitHub and what all you're going to need to know in order to get your projects featured and part of all of this. And so just to give you a bit of backstory, right, and break down GitHub, right? GitHub itself is a platform that holds things that we call repositories, right? A repository is essentially a you can think of it like a project. It's a project that contains some code. It's a folder of different code, for lack of better words. A repository in GitHub is important because it is going to make sure that you have, it's going to help you keep track of the files within that project or within that folder over time, which is an incredibly important function, especially when your projects get bigger, there's more files that you're working with, and you're going to be collaborating with people on it. And we'll talk a little bit about that in a second. So, with GitHub, what we do is we, as people and different organizations, have the opportunity to create repositories. And a repository on GitHub is really just meant, like I said, to hold some of the code that we are working on at different points in time. So I just want to go to my profile on GitHub real quick, just so y'all can see. So this is my GitHub profile page. So like if you went to GitHub and went to my page, this is what you'd see. The GitHub profile page is again, it serves this kind of professional networking purpose where, hey, you know, people can see who you are as an individual and the projects that you are allowing them to see from your GitHub page. There's two types of projects on GitHub, public and private projects. A lot of companies have private repos that they keep there to just make it so that it's a little bit more secure. But public repos are still a good choice for people like us who are really wanting to showcase our work to the world and let people know here is what we're capable of working on. But in order to be kind of clear to y'all on in order to be clear to y'all, like on like a repository, for instance, I want to just show you a repository of my own. Let me just find one that will be decent enough to show. I'm trying to find one that might have a good uh, couple things in it. Actually, I know the perfect one to show. As you can see, I got a lot of different repos. Some of these are actual projects, some of these are test projects, or different things I was doing to teach or whatnot. And yeah, everybody's going to end up using GitHub in some capacity. It just is a helpful tool for that. I think my tic-tac-toe repo has a couple things in it. So let me see. Commits. Okay, cool. So let's take, for instance, this repository of code, which is a tic-tac-toe project that I worked on a couple years ago. this project is what GitHub is all about, right? It's a space that I can go to see all of the different code related files that I have for that project, right? And these files are stored in a very specific way to ensure that I can do things like keep track of the changes that I've made to these files over time. The Another aspect of what GitHub allows us to do is not only just see the files and see that we've made changes, we can actually save snapshots of those changes in our project and see those snapshots, which we call commits, right? And so these are where Git commits are visualized for us in GitHub. So GitHub is an amazing tool because it is both a data storage solution, but it also does a lot of work helping us visualize what we've done with our project using Git. And so that's the first and most important part to demystify for people, right? There is a difference between GitHub and Git, right? Git itself is the tool that allows for us to create repositories and to store code in a way that we can keep track of changes and keep snapshots of our work with commits. And we then use GitHub as a place to store our Git repositories and visualize them and interact with them on the web like I'm doing here. So let's see that in action, and then we'll go through the stages of pushing a project to GitHub so that y'all can see what are the things that you're going to have to do in order to move from, hey, I'm working on a new project to now my project is on GitHub like this, and I can see the files, I can see my commits, and people can interact with me by making things like pull requests, or I can collaborate with people on this project, etc. So to do that, we're going to go back a step and go into VS Code. So I'm just going to open up a new VS Code window, and essentially, right, if we're starting any new project, we're going to want to create a folder for that project. And so like y'all might know from watching some of my other videos on the channel or just being in the class, right, I care a lot about creating folders for all my projects. I'm very, very annoying about that. I tell people this all the time. Create a folder for your project, store your code in a folder. It's just going to make your life easier. I've always said that. And now, hopefully, through this example, you'll see why, right? So the first thing I want to do in this VS Code window is actually create a new folder. And the quick cheat code that I like to do is I like to click this open button, the open folder button that's right here on the start screen, and create a folder there. So you won't be able to see it when it pops up with my file browser. But when I click that, it shows all my files. If you're following along, go ahead and click that. You should be able to see all of your files. And just choose a new, create a new folder for the sake of what we're going to work on, which might be a simple HTML website that we'll put on GitHub, right? So I'm going to save this new folder on my desktop, but I'm going to name it, let's say HTML for GH, or yeah, HTML for GitHub, just so that it's clear for everybody. So I made that new folder. I called it HTML, the number 4 GitHub, and you'll see now VS Code will go ahead, refresh, and open that folder for me. A way to make sure that you're actually working in the folder you create is that you'll see at the top of VS Code is this Explorer, and it should have the name of whatever the folder is that you just created there. And so if you are following along with me for me to keep track of that, just go ahead and give me a thumbs up real fast. That way I know, oh, some folks are actually going to work on this alongside me. Cool. I see some folks are going at it with me. Cool. So then, yeah, I'll make sure I paste it so that y'all can follow along. What we're going to do is build a super simple website, but we're going to talk about Git, and we're going to talk and push it to GitHub, hopefully by the end of the stream. So awesome, fam. So first step is we need that new folder for working with our files, right? And again, I'm talking about web dev stuff, so we're talking about HTML right here, but this is the same process if you're working on a Java app, or if you're working on a Python project, or if you're working on a mobile app, right? Doesn't really matter what stack you're working on. This is all about creating a place where your code is going to be housed, right? There's ways you do that for Java projects. There's ways you do that for Python projects. There's ways you do that for mobile projects. But at the end of the day, you're going to have a folder where you put your code, right? I think we can all agree that that's the case. So now I just need some code, right? So if I'm building a website, like a lot of what I talk about is building websites, right? First thing I want to do is create a index.html page, just something that I can use to start writing my original HTML information, right? So here I'm going to just start a new index.html page with an HTML tag to just kind of represent our document. And a couple of the important tags that we need for any HTML document are the head and the body, right? So for those of y'all who may be not familiar with HTML too much, right? This is just a simple HTML document. There's nothing really going on in here yet. But this is like kind of the basics that we need to get our HTML functioning as an actual document. For the sake of this example, I will just add one line of HTML in here, just kind of add a heading that says, yo, right? And that's just meant so that, I can actually see this HTML page and confirm that it's working and stuff like that. So the I'm sorry, I just read the chat and y'all have me dying. That is crazy. Rose, create the folder. So we have this HTML page, right? You can go ahead and make whatever you want. If y'all are in the web dev space, go ahead and sauce this up however you want. It doesn't really matter because we're just going to use this as an example of a project we might work on together. So let's say that, hey, I'm actually going to build a site that's not just going to have an HTML file. I might also include some CSS. So I might say, oh, cool, let me add my styles.css file in here as well. And that styles.css file is going to have a style for my H1 element that is just going to make it so my color is blue or something like that, right? So this is just some basic CSS to say, hey, find an H1 element in my HTML document, and let's make sure that the color of that H1 is blue. If I save this and I go back to my index.html, I can now say, hey, okay, I have two files for this website. I have an HTML file and I have a CSS file. They're not connected yet. We'll connect them in a second, but I have those two files, right? And I might say, okay, cool. These are all the files I'm going to work on to like make this project the most amazing website or, the most amazing project ever, right? I just want to be able to use this. I might continue to work on this HTML document, continue to work on this CSS. But this is a great point to say, okay, let me start the process of tracking all of the work that I'm going to do in case something happens, right? What happens if I make a change that I don't like? Or what happens if I'm like, hey, I might be building this project because I know I'm going to work with other people on it. And I want those other people to know, here's all of the things I did on the project, right? Well, all of those use cases are great use cases for using Git, right? Git is in itself a tool that we use to keep track of our code in the folders and projects that we're setting up. So Git is the tool that you got to use on your local machine in order to keep track of all of the changes that you're adding to your projects over time, right? You could think of it like whenever you want to save a game, like when you're playing a video game, you're like, oh, I got to go ahead and go to the checkpoint and save the game real quick. Like that's what we use Git for, is like saving the game at different checkpoints. And then we can go back to those checkpoints whenever we need to say, hey, let me go back to that checkpoint and do some stuff because something messed up down the road or whatnot. Git itself, to just break us from VS Code real quick, right? Git itself is a tool that you have to install on your machine, right? Git is its own tool. You gotta have it on your machine to work with it. If you go to the git-scm.com website, this will allow you to download Git for your particular operating system. So for me, it's showing me Mac, but for you, if you go on with Windows, you'll see Windows. If you go on with a Linux, you'll see Linux. you need to download Git on your machine in order for you to use it to save some of these changes, right? So to do that, I'm assuming that you already have Git at least installed on your machine. And what you want to do is you want to use Git in order to save these snapshots of your code over time, right? That's just going to allow you over the course of working on your project to have those little snapshots that you can refer back to. So to do that, what I'm going to do is open a new terminal in VS Code. And again, one of the reasons why I'm really, really a stickler about folders is because if you use VS Code and open the terminal in VS Code like this, it makes your life so simple if you already have opened a folder. Because now I'm immediately in the folder that I have these files stored in. And that is immensely important when you start working with Git, because you need to run Git inside of a folder. That is like the point number one that a lot of people don't realize. And then they have Git working and the number in their files are all over the place and it's not working as they expect. If you want to have a very smooth time working with Git and GitHub and all of those tools, you're going to want to make sure you keep your code organized in folders that are clear, right? So this is a folder strictly for this project, my HTML for GitHub project, right? I have 2 files in here right now. And what I want to do is I want to start the process of keeping track of these files in Git. That way I can keep those snapshots and have references to all of the changes I do over time. So let's take a look at that and work on it a little bit together. So if you're following along with me, open a terminal, and the first command that you need to know in order to work with Git on your projects is the git init command. Git init is a command that will initialize a new Git repository, there's that word again, in our folder, right? So go ahead and run this and you should see something like this, initialize empty Git repository, and you should see a path to whatever folder you're currently in. What this just did was it initialized a folder in our inside of this folder that we're working in. It created a new folder for us that we can't really see right now. I'm trying to figure out why it's not showing my hidden files there, but let me actually see. Okay, no worries. What this line did, this initialize empty Git repository, is it created a new folder for us in our project folder, and that folder is called Git, right? And so I can't see it in here on the Explorer, but if you go ls-a or something to see kind of all your files, you can see that .git folder is inside of this folder for me now. So it just creates a hidden file. It's what we call a hidden file or a hidden folder. But that hidden file folder has a lot of tools inside of it to keep track of our project now that we initialized it. Even if you can't see the .git file, if you want to confirm whether or not you have Git inside of a folder, there's another command that's really helpful, which is git status. If you run git status in a folder, you should see something like on branch master, no commits yet. If this is already a Git repository. If it's not, you'll see something that says something like is not a Git repository, right? Like it'll tell you, hey, this isn't a Git repository yet. There's no Git is not initialized in this folder yet. So the first thing we got to do is initialize Git. And then the second thing is to ensure that it's there, right? Okay, like we got Git status to do that. Number of ways we can do that. And what we see when we do this Git status is a couple other new words that we haven't talked about yet. Branch master. Okay, no commits yet. We did kind of talk about commits a little bit. We saw those on GitHub, but we don't really know what the connection is yet. And then untracked files. Use git add to include in what will be committed. See some red files here. And it says nothing added to commit, but untracked files present. Use git add to track. So let's break this down, right? And I wished when I was doing a lot of these operations, somebody just broke all of this stuff down for me, right? So Git is a command line tool. We're going to always be running that tool in our command line, right? And of course, there's other apps that you could use to work with Git. But one of the reasons why it's good to learn it on the command line is because the command line is on every operating system. So if you can make it work there, you can make it work in a number of different environments. Whereas, you can't always install the GitHub. You can't always install other apps to do this stuff for you, let's say. But Git status is just a tool that you use to check out what's going on inside of a Git repository. So if you get a new folder from someone's like, hey, take a look at this code, and they send you a folder full of code. One thing that you should do is check if there's Git initialized in that folder. You could do that really quickly by just typing Git status inside of a terminal that is pointing at that folder, right? So that's what this first line was doing, was just seeing if we had Git installed in this particular project. Then the line that it returns, so all of this is what that command returned. On branch master, Git allows us to create what we call branches of our project. The branches essentially act as timelines of those snapshots. So remember I said, hey, we're going to use it to store these snapshots of our code. A branch you could think of as like a timeline of specific snapshots. And branches get a little bit more sophisticated when you are collaborating or you create more branches, because it works out that you can actually create separate timelines based off of different histories, which is really a complicated topic, but it's really helpful because let's say I'm working on one project and I'm like, hey, I'm making 1, 2, 3 commits, right? I might make a separate branch off of one of those commits, and then somebody else on my team might work off that branch, and they're making completely different changes on a completely different timeline than the one that I'm working on. And that's kind of how branches work, is like they allow you to work on different, to save different snapshots of the same starter code in different moments. So we'll talk more about that as we get more sophisticatedly into collaboration and working on more advanced features with Git and Git based projects. But you don't really need too many branches if you're working by yourself. And so to start is, if you're working by yourself, Git creates a default branch for you, and they call it master. So the master branch is meant to be kind of like the default branch. It's the branch that is the first initialized branch that you use to keep your history together. And like I said, the branch really is just storing all of the different snapshots that we take. Those snapshots are what we call commits. So when you say no commits yet, it just means that we haven't actually taken any snapshots of our code at any moment yet. So no commits just means, hey, you haven't done any saving of the snapshots yet. Untracked files really gets into the way that Git works, right? Git is looking at this folder and it's looking at all of the files that we have in there, and it's looking at in all of these files what has changed in those files. If something's changed, it will let us know that something's been modified or something's been updated, and it will tell us, hey, there's changes in this file, and we can add those changes to another snapshot, another commit. Right now, it's saying that we have untracked files, which means that there are files present in our folder, in our project, but those files are not currently being watched by Git. Like Git is saying, hey, I see you have these 2 files, index.html, right, and styles.css. These are the 2 files that I created, but right now they're not being tracked. We're not really going to keep track of them unless you want us to, is what it's saying here. So I want it to, and it's telling me exactly what I need to do that. It says use git space add file to include what we want to save in our snapshot. Nothing added to commit, right? But untracked files present, use git add to track. This is kind of another statement saying the same thing as this statement above, right? So recap, Git status will let us see like the status of a project that is using Git. We use branches to hold snapshots of these different pieces of code over time. Those branches are full of what we call commits, and those commits are snapshots that we save of our project files over time. In order to save a commit, we need to specify which files we want to save, and Git will keep track of changes to those files over time. And that is how it all really works. So for now, to make my first commit, right? Because now I want to take my first snapshot of this starter code that I'm working on. I want to run the command git add, and I can do one of two things. I can use git add to add files to my to be tracked, and then those files are basically what I can save as a snapshot. So one thing I can do is I can specify specifically the files that I want. So I can say, hey, git add my index.html, just like this, right down here. And if I do that, I'm like, okay, I see I got a new line, but then I love doing git status because it will show you the status of my project with Git. So now you can see the same thing saying still on the same branch. We still haven't made a commit yet, but now you can see changes to be committed was added, and we can see that there's a new file that is now a change to be committed. Again, anything that's a change to be committed means that when we make that snapshot, those are the things that will be in that next snapshot that we're taking, that new commit. We still see though that there's some untracked files, right? Because I didn't add styles.css yet. So again, I could just say git add styles.css, right? But over time, you're gonna start having like projects full of files, right? And sometimes you're not gonna want to just type each file manually line by line by line, right? In this case, because there's only two, I could just go ahead and just kind of hit a git add styles.css. But let's say I have 20 files in there and I'm like, oh my gosh, I just want to add everything without having to type it one by one. You can use the shortcut git space add space dot, which is going to add all of the files that were previously untracked into the to be tracked. And so now these files went from red to green, and they're saying, hey, these files are ready to be committed, essentially. Now that we have the right files we want, right? And it's not often what git add dot does is it adds every file, right, inside of your folder. Sometimes you want that, sometimes you don't. So you know, hey, you can specify files specifically, or you could use a shortcut like git add dot to add all of the files. There are a couple other shortcuts that we'll get into in some future videos and stuff. But now we're ready to make our first commit, which is great. So it's a very simple process to do that. Now that we've added the files that we want to change, next we want to just make a commit. And the command to make a commit, let me just clear this so it's a little bit easier for y'all. See, the command to make a commit is git commit, and then we always leave a message with our commits. So you're always going to say git commit -m, and you're going to type a little message inside of quotation marks to save that snapshot with a message about it so that it's easy to keep track of, well, what is this snapshot really about? Or what's changing in this particular snapshot? The reason that's helpful is just because it'll help you keep track of your code at those different moments. So the more descriptive you can make this message, really the better for you. So you know, hey, here's what this particular snapshot contains. So I'm going to say for this one, I'm going to say initial HTML/CSS file. And again, I just type a little simple message inside of these quotation marks, right? And then I press enter, and I've made now my first commit. And you'll see this, it says, hey, 2 files changed. If you're following along, you've done the same amount of files as me. You'll see however many files were changed and however many lines of code were inserted or deleted or modified. In our case, we just wrote a couple lines of code, right? We have 7 on this particular file, and then we have 4 on this, right? So that's where it's getting 11 from. So yeah, so we made that commit, and now you can see there's a couple of things that kind of came back after I made that commit, right? I got this message that says something about my name and my email were configured automatically to check, make sure they're specified. So if you get a message like this is just saying, hey, we got some information about you that we use to source who made this commit, but you can make some changes to that if you don't like it. You might also get another message that says, hey, we don't have your name or your email configured yet. Please set them, and it'll give you some commands to set your username and your email if you haven't yet already. In my case, my name and email are fine, so I'm not tripping about that. So I'm not actually going to need to run these commands, but they're just telling me, hey, if you wanted to fix this, you could run these commands. The most important thing is this right here, where it says, hey, you know, 2 files change, 11 insertions, etc. If I type git status one more time now, you're going to see it says, hey, on that branch, there's nothing to commit. Our working tree is clean, right? The tree is really the source of all of the different snapshots, right? They basically are saying there's no changes left for us to worry about between our code and the code that's currently stored in Git. And that's, my friends, literally, that's all you got to know to set stuff up with Git, right? Git is pretty simple, right? So to recap, let's pretend now that we're going to continue working on this project. Again, I have an index.html page. I have a CSS page. If I were to actually run this in like a live server, right, we'll see, you know, our HTML page is here. We got the yo popping up. That's great. But, you know, if I was actually working on this and I said, hey, well, my style's not applying. Well, okay, I got to apply the styles. So to do that, I'm going to just go in my HTML. And again, this is just me working on the project. I'm continuing to work on the project. So in this case, what I want to do is I want to connect my HTML and my CSS file. And that's just the next step of this project. So first, I'm going to just create a new element inside of my HTML head called a link. I'm going to create a reference to my style sheet by passing in a URL to /styles.css. And this, my friends, if you are in the web dev space, this is just how we connect HTML to a CSS file. We use a link element with a relationship of a style sheet, and we pass the URL to that particular style sheet into our HTML's head so that we can connect to it. That's one way of using styles and CSS, but you know, I'm just working to connect these two things. Now that I added this line, if I go back to my project, you can see now that my HTML and CSS are clearly connected because my text changed from black to blue, which is great. This is exactly what I wanted to see based on this CSS that I added here. So I feel like that's a pretty great step, right? I just made a pretty significant change. Now I have my files are talking to one another, right? So I might say, hey, let me save this now. So I have that also stored and saved pretty effectively. So to do that, I'm going to just use git one more time. So I'm going to say git status real quick to just take a look. And as you can see, there's some changes on my index.html page, just like I just added this line 4. It's completely new here. One thing that's cool about VS Code is it'll give you things like this, like blue line here to help you see, hey, these things are new. Some modifications happened here, right? It also lets you know things have been modified with these little letters here. So the M here means that this file was modified, which is helpful for Git, for tracking things with Git. So VS Code knows it's modified, and as you can see, Git knows that it's modified as well, right? When we did git status this time, we can see, hey, our index.html file is modified, right? So now the goal is to keep track of that modification when we're ready to take another snapshot. So now I feel pretty good about taking another snapshot of my code here. So I'm just going to say git add. And again, I could say index.html since it's just one file, or I could use git add dot to add all of the files. Another shortcut that's really used that a lot of people like, when you're working with files that have been modified, you can use git add asterisk, and it will add all of the modified files that you have in your folder. So just trying to give y'all some insight into some other commands you can use. But either way, we need to add our files. So whether you use git add with the file name, git add dot, or git add asterisk, whatever, as you can see when you do a git status, you'll see that now that file is being tracked for changes. And you want it to be green like this. It's like, okay, cool, this file is going to be changed. Now, like we did before, I'm going to make a new commit. So git commit -m. I always want to leave a descriptive message. So I'm going to say connecting HTML and CSS. Press enter. And again, I can ignore this little message here for my configuration stuff. But I have, as you can see, one file change, 3 insertions, 1 deletion. If I do a git status on this now, I'm branch master, nothing to commit, working tree clean, right? So hopefully y'all can envision, right? If I'm continuing to make changes, like now, I'm going a little crazy. I'm gonna add a div, and inside of that div, I'm gonna have a paragraph, and the paragraph is just gonna be like, I really only made this so I can show my homies how to use Git and GitHub. Put an emoji in there because I'm feeling like that right now. You know what I'm saying? Like, let's get a little shrug emoji in there. And let's make that shrug emoji a person of color because y'all know the vibes. And we gonna shave this, right? And again, the workflow for me is the same workflow as if I'm working on any other type of app, right? I'm making changes, taking a look at my environment to see those changes live, right? If this was a mobile app, I'd be doing this in Xcode or doing this in Android Studio and making sure, hey, the code I'm writing is changing what I want to see, etc. And now I'm like, oh, cool. I'm ready to make a change and save that change. All right, great. I can then do git add, whatever I want to add, git commit to add a new commit and just say, adding paragraph text, or like adding paragraph text isn't as descriptive. I'm gonna just say adding description of site. Site text. Sorry, it's on so many lines I can't really see. Again, I'm seeing that those files were changed. All's good. If I do git status, right, I'm good. Made the commit. Everything is groovy. So give me a thumbs up. Hopefully I'll get this. I don't have to keep repeating the process, but I'm making changes on my code. As I make the changes, I might take a look, make sure the changes are really there. And then when I'm ready to say, hey, I want to save these changes, that's when I'm like, okay, cool. Let me get into Git stuff, right? Let me get into saving those changes with Git. That makes sense to you? Just give me a quick thumbs up, right? Because that's really the workflow. And hopefully you can see, hey, this doesn't have to just be like this only on web dev stuff. This could be like this if this was a Java project. This could be like this if this was a different stack, right? But the process will always be the same, right? You work on your code, and when you're ready to make a save, you say, hey, let me use Git to make the save. There's three key things you need to do in order to save your work. The first is you need to make sure in your folder where you're saving your code, you have Git initialized in your folder. Initializing Git is like that git init command that you saw I used earliest, right? Git init will initialize a new repository for you. The second thing is you need to add the files that you want to commit. So that's why you saw me using the git add command. If I go up a little bit in this terminal, you should see it. Right, so we use the git init to create the repo. We use git add to add our files, and then we use git commit in order to really create those snapshots, right? So remember, git add and git commit are really the two most important ones outside of, earlier, a long time ago, we used git init to set up the first repo, set our repo up. So those are really the three commands you got to really know. Git init to set it up, git add to add your files, and git commit to make your commits. Everything else is just more sophisticated work on top of using Git. So let's get back to our code for a second. Right, so now I have this website, I have some CSS, right? Clearly I can add more CSS, I can add more HTML. We can keep building a website out. But let's say I'm finished, right? Let's say I'm like, okay, cool. I'm like ready to go. I'm like, all right, boom. Like I have this paragraph, got the div there, and I'm like feeling good about this site. And I'm like, hey, I'm ready to save this site to GitHub, right? Well, that's where Git has done its job. It saved snapshots of our code. And now the goal is to have this repository from Git hosted on GitHub. That's really the key difference here. To give y'all that added confidence that Git is really doing a lot of stuff for us. One last command that's really helpful to know is Git. There's two kind of commands in this. One is the git log command. The git log command lets you kind of go up and down with the arrow keys to take a look at any commits that you have already made, and they're really descriptive. It'll show you the commit with a particular hash number to reference it. who was the author, what was the date and time, and here's where those descriptions come in handy. So we can see all of those snapshots. These are all of the snapshots I saved, right? So remember, first was this initial HTML, CSS, then it was the connecting, then it was adding the description, and then that was kind of the last one, I think, right? So I can quit this, just go to the colon, press Q to get out of that. A separate command that does a similar thing in Git is git short log, which also does a better way of just kind of briefly showing you who's working, how many commits, and what were the commits, right? So the git short log command is like the same thing in terms of showing the commits, but it really just shows you the messages of those commits really quickly. Both are helpful to show you that, hey, we just saved a bunch of snapshots of our code. And it's really important to know that with these snapshots, right, they have these unique IDs and references that you can use to say, hey, let's say I made a mistake and I want to go back to one of these versions. Using Git, you can do that very easily. It's a little bit more, it talks about a couple other themes that are a little bit more advanced, but just know for yourself right now that you can do that. That's the purpose, is that if you mess up, there is a way for you to go back to an old version of your code. And we'll talk about it, but in a future video, in a future moment. So here is where here's where everything kind of gets interesting, right? Is now that we have Git, we have this repository, we have commits and snapshots of our code in this repository. Now we want to know what do we got to do to push this to GitHub, right? We're done with our project and we're like, hey, I want my project to be on GitHub so other people can use it, or, recruiters can see my work, etc. Right? In order to get a project on GitHub, you have to have some project ready to go like this on your computer in some capacity. So we have a new project. And the commands for creating that connection between Git and GitHub, let me just clear this real quick, requires a couple things that isn't related to Git at all. We've done what we need to do on our local project. We're ready to go. Now we just need to set up GitHub on our machines so that we can properly send the files from our computer to GitHub. And so to do that, what we're going to do is we're going to pause on this aspect of adding to our code. And we're going to just talk a little bit more about what do we got to do to go from, that project down there that we were working on in VS Code to the project being able to be seen on GitHub like this, right? New project with all of those files. And that hopefully now you can see GitHub is really just visualizing a lot of the things we were just talking about with Git, right? It's visualizing the name of our project, what branch are we on, how many branches, who is making commits, what are the names of those, like the messages of those commits, and when were they made? These little hash values are the same hash values that we just saw. This is the time it takes and the number of commits, right? So GitHub is really just visualizing all of the stuff that Git is doing in our projects. All GitHub really is a place, it's really in the name, it's a hub of Git projects, Git repositories. That's what GitHub is. But in order to connect your projects to GitHub, it's fairly simple, but there's a couple steps that you're going to have to do in order to get it working on your side. The most important thing, and I'll talk about the most important thing and leave the kind of semantic stuff out for a second. The most important thing is if I'm ready to push my project to GitHub, I need to create a new repository on GitHub. And the new repository on GitHub is just going to be a repository that I use to connect the one I made on my computer to this one that I'm creating that's going to be stored on GitHub. So typically how we do this is the new repository that you make on GitHub will have like a similar name as the project that you worked on. So I made one project called HTML for GH, or I think it was for GitHub, kind of like this. If you have multiple accounts, you'll see this kind of drop down or choose an owner. But if you only have your personal account, it'll just say, here's your personal account, right? And now I'm just creating a new repository. Some of the things here you don't really need to do. Description of the repository is optional. Public or private, this is where you can toggle whether you want it to be shown to everyone or whether it's just going to be only shown to you. Again, there's some projects that you might want to keep private, but you do want to have some projects public because that's what people will see when they go to your profile. This one, because it's teaching and learning, I don't really care. We can leave it public for now. Some of this stuff about initialize this repo with a README or git ignore file or license, you don't really need to worry about. And if you're just getting started, I recommend, especially if you're following kind of the format I did, where it's like, hey, I worked on my code, I made my commits, and I just want to push it to GitHub. You don't need any of these things right now. There are times where you might want some of these things, but you can create them yourselves. You don't need to have it created for you through GitHub. So typically, when I create a new repo in GitHub, it's real simple. I come in, give it a name, make sure I select public or private, and then I'll just go ahead and create repo. And that's going to bring us to this lovely starter screen here where GitHub is going to give us some options of things to do. So now that I made this repository on GitHub, I can either add people to it to say, hey, let me add people who are going to work on this with me. They have a new feature in GitHub where you can actually code, you can actually pull this code up in an editor and like a developer environment, which is really dope. It's called Code Spaces. I think that's a really cool feature. But for us, we need to get our code up there. And so everything here on the bottom is helping us think about what do we got to do to get our code from our local computer to GitHub. And here's where there's some interesting things that you got to keep in mind, right? There are a couple of different ways that you can connect your local repository with the one, and local repository means the one on your computer that you made in VS Code, if you were following along with me, and the remote repository, which is what GitHub really is a remote repository. It's a repository remote from your computer. The three ways that GitHub is presenting for us, if we want to do a quick setup and connect these things, are, hey, you can click this button to set up in GitHub desktop if you have that app, or you can use HTTPS or SSH to grab a particular URL representing or a path representing kind of a connection to GitHub, to the GitHub repository that you're building. Basically, what you have to do is one of these kinds of things, right? Are we creating a new repository on the command line, or we're pushing an existing repository from the command line? In our case, we already made a repository. So what we want to do is we actually want to just push an existing repository, which is the one we made in VS Code, to GitHub. And so we can follow these instructions to do that. Just to give you context, these instructions are basically saying, hey, you have a repository somewhere on your computer, you made a project folder, you initialize Git, you save some stuff, you're already good. Here's what you got to do to connect that repository to GitHub, right? Here's what you got to do to like get ready and push it to GitHub as well. So let's just run those couple commands for a quick second and take a look at what happens, right? So now I made the repository. I'm just going to go ahead, copy git remote add origin. That's the first command. And where we're going to put this is we're going to run this in the project folder that we use to create the Git in the first place. So I'm going to go back to VS Code in the terminal there, and I'm going to run git remote add origin, and I'm going to run this next command, git branch -m main. I will explain to y'all what each of these are doing in a quick second. And then I'm going to run git push -u origin main. And what we're going to see, actually what's interesting here is VS Code has an extension. I don't know if y'all can actually see this pop up. VS Code has a GitHub extension, and it's asking me to sign in using GitHub. So I could say allow here, and what that's going to do is pull up a OAuth window for me to connect VS Code to GitHub. So once I do that, it's signing in for me and signs in and does a couple things to allow for me now to push this repo automatically to GitHub. So you'll know that things are fine if at the end you kind of see it say, hey, you know, resolving deltas 100%, you know, it has the link to this GitHub link that is right here, and it says something like branch something set up to track something. If I go back to GitHub, which where did it go? Right. Let's just break down what those commands were doing. The first command that we ran, get remote add origin with this HTTPS link. Remember, HTTPS link, this HTTPS link came from above here, right? It's this link here. This is saying, hey, I want to use Git. So remember, we're still using Git to do everything. Git is the command tool that does everything for us. So it's like git remote add origin, and then this URL to github.com, something, something, something. The remote, git remote basically is referencing like the remote repository that we're creating, right, here in GitHub. And get remote add is basically a command to add a new remote repository to our project. Any remote repository can be added with a alias that we can use to reference that repository. So in this case, GitHub says, hey, you should name this remote repository origin. And then it gives you the link to wherever that remote repository is. This is important because there's a number of different places where you can have a remote repository hosted. You can host it on GitHub, you can host it on GitLab, Bitbucket. There's a lot of different tools actually outside of GitHub where you can store your Git repositories and collaborate with people, and different companies use different ones for different reasons. But the command to add those remote repositories are the same, right? Use git remote add, give it an alias, and then pass the actual URL that is directing to either that HTTPS site, or if you're not using HTTPS, you can do a more secure connection to GitHub using SSH. And as you can see, this provides address that we can reference with SSH in order to connect there. So there's a couple ways to set up GitHub to connect. One is with HTTPS, which is what we just did, which is fairly simple, especially because VS Code made some stuff simple for us. And then SSH, which is also very simple. In the sense that we use the same command, but I just wanted to point out that the URL. Either way, we ran that command and it added a new remote repository to our project. You can always test, you can see like what remote repositories are connected to your particular project if you do the command git remote -b. And that will show you, hey, you have a remote repository called origin, and you have it set up so that you can either fetch changes from it or push changes to it. This is important when you get into permissions with Git and GitHub. This means that we have permission to pull changes and we have the permissions to push our changes there. So that's what that first line did, is give us all of that. Then we have git branch -m main. This command is really not super necessary, but GitHub believes that we should name, instead of naming that branch, that default branch master, they think we should name it main. So they just use this command to switch the name of the branch that was initially created in our project from master to main. And we can see that if we do git status now, you can see that instead of saying on branch master, it's just saying on branch main. So just kind of change the name of that. And then lastly, this is probably a more important command outside of like, so first we added the connection to GitHub, then we use git push -u origin main. And this command essentially is allowing us to push our local repository, the one we worked on, directly to GitHub, right? Git push pushes one repository to another repository. The -u is just saying, hey, we're pushing upstream somewhere. And we're basically, where we're pushing it up to is the remote repository called origin. Remember, origin is just a name we gave to reference this URL, which is the URL pointing to GitHub. And you can see after that, so git push -u origin just is saying, hey, we're going to push to the GitHub repository we connected. And then we put main here, which basically said, hey, push everything that I'm pushing from right now to a branch on the remote repository that's also called main. So that's why in the VS Code you can see when we did the when we I guess I cleared it so we can't see it. That's why when we ran the command, it said kind of you know, branch main tracking branch main or something like that, right? We have a new branch on our remote called main that is really kind of tracking the changes that were happening on our local repository as well. Once you've run these three commands, you're good. The push was successful. We can see it says on branch main. Oh, here it is. On branch main, our branch is up to date with origin main, right? So we're on our local branch main, and this is up to date with origins main, which is the GitHub repository there. I wanted to point out, you know, this other section here, there's doing the same three commands here at the end, but this is just saying, hey, if you're setting up a new repository, I don't really like this example because it's not realistic all the time if you don't know what this is doing. Basically, if you see it's doing git init to initialize a new folder with code, add to add a file, and then commit. So this is more like an example than it is how to create a new repository on the command line. To create a new repository, you always need to use git init though, right? And you got to add those files and commit some files before you can push anything. So you'll get errors if you try to push, but you never made like your first commit or anything like that. So just to give you kind of guidance as to what was this other stuff talking about here. I don't like it this way because, you know, it doesn't really give you a practical example like we just did, which is, hey, I actually was working on a project and I added git, made some changes, added commits, etc. Now you could just use this, right? These three. But cool. Since we ran that command, the git push -u origin main, and it was successful, all I got to do now is refresh, and I should see now that all my stuff is fully updated on GitHub. I have the branch main is here. We have that one branch. That's the only one we have. You can see a couple commits are here. These are all of the commits that I previously made on my local project. The initial HTML file, connecting and adding a description. All of that is right there, right? And GitHub now allows me to do a bunch of other things, right? I can, in the settings, I can add collaborators to the project. I can say, hey, you know, whoops, I can add collaborators to my project. I can let those collaborators make requests to add code changes. There's a lot that you could do now that the project is on GitHub. But one of the best things is, hey, now you have a space to show off the work that you're creating. So GitHub is a really awesome tool. In order to make it work, sometimes if you're not using that VS Code GitHub extension, you'll get some kind of pushback from GitHub related to authentication. And that was really the big thing that is kind of like missed sometimes when you are working on GitHub projects. Authentication with GitHub can happen in a couple different ways. You can either authenticate with GitHub via a personal access token, which is kind of what was going on. There's a couple ways that goes on. Username and password with two-factor authentication, or a pass key, or a SSH key, right? So these are the three ways that GitHub has to work with you to confirm your identity. The GitHub extension on VS Code actually does some of this for us, which is great. But there's other ways you can aren't using VS Code, or you're not using the GitHub extension that comes in VS Code. Some of those ways are you can use the GitHub CLI, right, to create. You can use the GitHub CLI, and the GitHub CLI has an off login function that run this function in one line. It'll help you authenticate with GitHub. You could also generate a new SSH key and add it to your machine if you want to authenticate that way. And then lastly, you can create a personal access token in GitHub if you want to do it that way. I'll share all the links to these because sometimes you have to authenticate a different way if you're not using VS Code. But hopefully, if you are using VS Code, it works just as seamlessly as you just saw it work for me. And you'll be able to get your projects up to GitHub and start sharing your work with all the wonderful people in the world. So that's my little spiel on Git and GitHub. I appreciate y'all good people for taking time and tuning in with me today. feel free to slide if you got somewhere else to be. And I'll see you next time. And stick around if you have some questions. Oh, if you like this lesson, and take care.